Code 3 Americans, this is part 2 of real inflation evidence revealed. In the first video, if you haven't watched that, go back and watch it. We showed you, we revealed obviously the inflation was at 8.5% March of 2022, but we went in and really showed you why that number, real evidence, why that number is so grossly misrepresented and why the politicians and central planners are essentially just admitting to the lowest number they can. The reality is those numbers are big. They're destroying wage earners and quite honestly transferring a tremendous amount of wealth to asset holders. So we're going to get into this video and talk about a little bit of why why inflation is required to stick around, how that's going to continue happening. And sorry about that, I had the slide wrong. So let me blow that up so you can see it. So this is an article from the St. Louis Fed from 2019, and it talks about essentially if you search where did the 2% inflation target come from, because the Federal Reserve, if you don't know, they've long targeted 2% a year in inflation. They do not want deflation. Go search it anywhere, you'll find out that is absolutely the case. They are scared to death of deflation, so they want about 2% a year in inflation. And lately, they've said they've been lagging that in the last decade, so they're willing to let it run a little bit hotter than than maybe just year over year, maybe over a longer period of time, as long as it averages out to about 2% a year. They came out and said that back then. So let's look at this. They set that in 2012, and I want you to remember January 2012, they come out and set the 2% target, even though down here they're saying, well, there's always kind of been an implicit inflation target of 2%. Okay, well, in January 2012, the Federal Open Market Committee, they came out and they said, hey, we're going to target 2% going forward. So just so you don't miss that, the inflation rate over the longer run is primarily determined by monetary policy. Okay, so this is what the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, issued in January 25th of 2012. Okay, so when they looked at their meeting notes, this is kind of what was determined. I want you to note inflation rate over the longer run is primarily determined by monetary policy. So what is monetary policy? Monetary policy is a set of tools that a nation's central bank has available to promote sustainable economic growth by controlling the overall supply of money. Why do I bring that up? Because right now you're hearing in the news Putin price hike, you're hearing fuel prices, oil prices, food prices, all these things aren't our fault. We can't do anything about it. It certainly wasn't anything with the stimulus spending. I'm going to show you some evidence. Stay tuned from a guy I was around last year that's certainly qualified to have an absolute opinion on this, and you're going to see why this is all a bunch of rubbish. So if you look at that, just really catch January 2012, they set the 2%, they come out and say it, and they acknowledge inflation is going to be controlled by monetary policy. And now the politicians are coming out. If you remember last year when Biden was trying to pass his big stimulus package at the end, he was saying, well, if you don't like inflation, you should pass this because it will actually help. They were saying all the stimulus was not the problem. Well, the reality is it is the problem. It's too much money chasing not enough stuff in the real economy. The solution is not more money, it's more stuff. You got supply chain disruptions, you got shortages of houses, you got shortages of all sorts of things, vehicles, and so forth. And yet you have extra money in people's pockets that creates more money chasing less stuff. And that is ultimately what leads to these inflationary problems. So I want to show you this chart and you're going to want to stick around because to the end here to see about the housing and why this was totally seen coming last year, maybe not quite this high, but certainly higher inflation than what you're being told. So over here on the left, we have percent of GDP, gross domestic product, and that's what these numbers represent relative to the total federal debt. So that's the blue line running here. This is the debt relative to gross domestic product in the United States. And the red line is just the federal outlays interest as a percentage of GDP. So how much interest we are paying on our debt as a nation relative to GDP. And those interest rates are represented right over here in the right column. So again, blue line, total public debt relative to GDP, which is on the left. Red line, the amount of interest we pay of our GDP, essentially percentage of GDP to service that debt. Now, don't tune out here. This isn't boring chart stuff. It's going to show you why. Remember the slide I just said? January 2012, the FOMC came out and targeted 2% inflation. I'm going to zoom up so you can see this. But if you look right here, 2012, look what's happening with the federal debt as relative to GDP percentage, right? Here's 100%. In January 2012, we're on a definite trend line up, pretty steady trend line up, and we're about to breach 100% debt to GDP. And you'll notice that's not the case back here. Okay, where remember the inflation was implicitly 2%, but now they just came out right about here and they said, okay, we're going to call it 2%. That's our stated objective. And then if you look what happens right through here, all of a sudden debt to GDP bounces along at above 100%. Now I'm going to show you why they want the inflation to help combat that. So why would it be above 100%? Well, we're spending more than we're taking in. We're taking in X amount of income in the form of taxes, X amount of revenue, and we're spending more than that in deficit spending. So this is how they can monetize all their little wish list things. And so forth. And they really need inflation to help combat that once it gets above 100%. And then, of course, we see the illness here that just skyrockets. It absolutely skyrockets to where in second quarter of 2020, which is right at the height of the illness, about 136% debt to GDP, meaning we were spending 36% more than we had the capability of taking in revenue. And then in Q4 2021, we're about 123%. So that came down. Now, that may have came down relative to the economy somewhat reopening, some of the states that had locked down, and maybe the GDP went up relative to more goods and services being exchanged. But there's also some inflationary results in here. So I really want to illustrate that. I know that it's kind of in the weeds here a little bit, but it's going to be important so you can see through the talking heads on the news. So let's have a little fictitious economy here. I want to say, let's pretend that we produce in our little pretend economy 100 John Deere tractors and they cost $1 a piece. So the 100 John Deere tractors cost $1 a piece. Therefore, our total GDP is $100 a year. And with those 100 tractors, we can plow 10,000, we can farm 10,000 acres of farm ground. Let's just pretend that's the case. So in our sample economy, let's say we also have 136% debt to GDP, much like we have right here. So this is what inflation can do. Let's say something comes along and makes those tractors cost more. Oh, I don't know, maybe a chip shortage, maybe an emissions problem where we got to worry about the environment. Now we got to put a bunch of urea tanks on there and DEF systems and all that. And maybe that tractor costs $1.13 now, but we still only sell 100 of them. That's $113 in GDP a year now, but we still only have 100 tractors farming 10,000 acres of land. So we don't have any more stuff. We don't have any more stuff. But now, you can't see that with that logo, but that number, maybe if I zoom up on that, that number is 123% now debt to GDP. See this? See what happened here? We had 136% when we were making these. We increased the price of them and we're at 123%. We dropped 13%, but we don't have any more stuff. Nothing changed. Okay. Nothing changed. So if you look at this example here. Well, there's a 13% representation. The debt to GDP drops as inflation starts to skyrocket through this time. See how it's coming down? Well, this is also during high inflationary times. So we're inflating away some of this problem. Yes, like I said, some of that is probably the economy reopening, but the end of the day, it is absolutely relative to high inflation. We are narrowing that gap. So I want to draw your attention here to Doug Duncan. I want to further illustrate that. This is Dr. Doug Duncan, and I was around him at an investment summit last year in Belize. And if you look here, Doug's qualified to have an opinion. If you look over here, he's a senior economist for Fannie Mae, which is are probably the largest mortgage lender. It's one of the government GSEs, government sponsored enterprises in the mortgage business. Enormous organization, enormous organizations, and this guy's in charge of forecasting and the analysis of the economy and mortgages and where the housing market's going. Um, he was named Bloomberg Business Week's 50 most powerful people in real estate. I mean, Doug is an awesome guy, super genuine, super nice, awesome guy to have a conversation with. If you ever get to watch him present, if you're ever interested in housing or investing or anything like that, he's just amazing. But here's what I want to draw you to. The FOMC, remember the Federal Open Market Committee, believed and I should say Doug presented this at the conference, so I'm just kind of telling you what I witnessed when he did this. He said, well, they believed they would raise rates in 2023. Fannie Mae believed to be in 2022. Now, Fannie underestimated the amount of inflation they would have, but the FOMC, if you remember, thought inflation be at 2.2% in 2021 and hit 2.7% in 2022. Well, we're about over 3 times that right now. So my point is they were wrong. This is also the people that were saying inflation is transitory. Inflation is transitory, even as the numbers were going up. And then all of a sudden, remember, we got to November of 2021, and and then all of a sudden, Jerome Powell says we need to retire the use of the word transitory. And then what? We had to have a new something to blame. So now it's going to be the Putin price hikes and everything else. At the end of the day, they were just wrong. And I'm going to show you, Doug did, that shows why there was a shortage of houses, and they could see that coming 8 years before it showed up. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. But here's what he put up. Remember all the stimulus, the stimmy checks and everything that went out and the child tax credits being advanced. Well, Doug pointed out, and this is in June of 2021, he pointed out for a couple with one child that had no money, they were not in the market to buy a home. It had an increase in their estimated liquidity of 11,400. If they'd have got the max stimulus via the stimmy checks and the child tax credits, suddenly they would have 11,400 liquid dollars that they did not otherwise have, and that made them eligible for a 3% down payment on a $380,000 house. Hmm. Why do you suppose we seen all the upward pressure then on kind of entry level homes? Well, that right there is why. So you got to get around people. You got to get in the right communities. Pay attention. Doug absolutely seen this coming. He probably underestimated it, to be fair, but at least he was on the right track when everybody else said otherwise. So when you're hearing the talking heads in the news, it is just a bunch of smoke screens, guys. Inflation is around. It's always going to be around. The system requires it. When you're spending more money than you take in, that's just the way it is. It kills wage earners, it rewards asset holders, and that creates a whole nother set of problems. So I really wanted you to see some of that evidence so that you could kind of weed through what's going on. Now, if you didn't see part one, video one, make sure you watch that. We'll throw the tab here so you can click on that as the next video, and it'll really talk about how to wade through the consumer price index. So the inflation numbers are kicking out. And then what can you do in the meantime? You can like the video on YouTube. That helps us out. Please do that. Share it with some friends, and then send an email to community@code3assets.com so you're on our newsletter if you're not already, and you get invites to meetups and stuff so you can get plugged into information like I shared there that Doug shared with me. How did I get that? I went to a meetup last year and was seeing information well before other people were seeing it. So that's how you do it. That's how you stay ahead of the curve. Until next time, let's go out and make things happen, as we say in the SWAT world. Get ready to move, make things happen. We say teams up, we execute. Catch you on the next one.